Imagine watching your child, your whole world, your reason for breathing, lie still in a bed that costs more than most people earn in a year, surrounded by the best doctor's money can buy, in a mansion so large it has its own zip code, and still not being able to fix him. Imagine being the man who built empires, the man who made his first million before 30, the man whose name appears on buildings, on hospitals, on the lips of every business journalist in the country. The man who has never, not once in his entire adult life, been told that something is impossible. Now imagine someone telling you that your 2-year-old son may never open his eyes again. That is where we begin. Not in a boardroom, not on the cover of Forbes, but in a quiet, dimly lit nursery on the 3rd floor of a Chicago mansion where a little boy named Elias had not opened his eyes in 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. His father knew the exact count. He had been counting every single morning when he walked through that door, looked at his son's still face, and whispered the same prayer he had whispered the day before. Please, just look at me. Just once. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, a 3-year-old girl with pigtails and a plastic water bottle changed everything. This is not a fairy tale. This is a story about love, desperation, and the kind of miracle that doesn't come wrapped in science or money. It comes in tiny shoes and a gap-toothed smile, carrying a bottle of water that nobody asked her to spill. Stay with me, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Before we dive into this story, I have to stop for just a moment because this community means everything to me, and I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from right now? Are you watching from the United States? Maybe you're curled up on the couch somewhere in Texas or New York or California, and this video just found you at exactly the right moment. Are you watching from the United Kingdom? From Canada? Maybe sitting with a warm cup of tea while the weather does what it always does? Are you joining us from Australia, from India, from Germany, or somewhere else entirely, somewhere I haven't even mentioned? Drop your country in the comments right now. Just your country, just one word. You have no idea how much it means to see those comments roll in from every corner of the globe, to know that this little community of ours stretches across oceans and time zones and languages. We are so many different people, and yet here we are, gathered together for one story. So tell me where you are, and then settle in. Get comfortable, because the story of Dominic Hargrove and his son Elias, and a young maid named Clara, and her impossible 3-year-old daughter named Rosie, it is going to take you somewhere you did not expect to go today. Let's begin. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in rooms where sick children sleep. It is not peaceful. It is not the silence of a library or a church or a forest at dawn. It is heavy, thick with held breath and unspoken bargaining, with the weight of prayers that feel like they are falling into nothing. It is the silence of a parent trying very hard not to fall apart. Dominic Hargrove knew that silence better than he knew anything else in the world. He had built Hargrove Capital from a single laptop and an idea that everyone told him was too ambitious. By 26, he had his first major acquisition. By 30, he had offices in 6 cities. By 34, he had been featured on the cover of 3 separate magazines in 1 year, and journalists wrote about him the way people wrote about forces of nature, with a mixture of admiration and slight, unspoken fear. Dominic had never been afraid of anything. He was 6 feet 2 inches of controlled discipline, of early mornings and cold showers and spreadsheets that never had errors and decisions that were always 3 steps ahead of everyone else's. He wore his confidence the way other men wore cologne. You smelled it before you saw him coming. But none of that, not one single achievement, not one single dollar, had prepared him for fatherhood. And nothing in the universe had prepared him for losing his wife 18 months after Elias was born. Her name was Naomi. She had been a landscape architect, which Dominic always found quietly funny because she was the least outdoorsy person he had ever met, and yet she designed gardens that made people weep with their beauty. She had dark curly hair and a laugh that could fill a room and a habit of stealing all the blankets and then looking completely innocent when confronted about it. She had died in a car accident on a Wednesday morning in February, 17 months before our story begins. She had been driving to a nursery, the plant kind, not the baby kind, to pick up bulbs for a client's spring garden. A truck ran a red light. The rest of it does not need to be described. The rest of it is the kind of sentence that ends everything. Dominic had taken 3 days off work. That was all he allowed himself. Then he had placed his son in the arms of a full-time nanny, hired 3 more support staff, and returned to the office because motion was the only thing that kept the grief from consuming him entirely. He told himself Elias was too young to understand what had happened. He told himself a child that small would not remember. He told himself the best thing he could do was provide security, stability, the kind of life that Naomi would have wanted for their boy. What he did not allow himself to consider was whether Elias could feel it anyway. Whether a 14-month-old child could sense the sudden absence of the warmest presence in his small world. Whether grief, for a baby too young for words, might express itself not in tears, but in stillness. The first time Dominic noticed something was wrong, Elias was 16 months old. He had been sitting in his high chair at breakfast, and Dominic had waved a brightly colored toy in front of his face, one of those rattles that lights up and makes noise, and Elias had not tracked it. His eyes had moved, but not toward the toy, not toward anything in particular. Dominic had told himself it meant nothing. By 18 months, 3 different pediatric ophthalmologists had told him it meant something. By 20 months, the word being used was idiopathic, meaning no one knew why. Elias's eyes were physically intact. The structures were healthy. There was no detectable damage, no tumor, no definable disease process. But the brain was not responding correctly to light. The pathways were misfiring, or not firing at all, in ways that the doctors kept explaining and re-explaining in increasingly complicated language that all meant the same thing. We do not know how to fix this. For a man like Dominic Hargrove, those 6 words were the most frightening sentence he had ever encountered. He responded to them the way he responded to every other challenge in his life, by throwing resources at the problem. He hired a team. Then he hired a second team to evaluate the first team. He flew specialists in from Boston, from London, from Tokyo. He funded 2 separate research initiatives at universities he endowed with enough money to make them take his calls on Sundays. He renovated the entire 3rd floor of his home into what one of the nannies quietly referred to as the most expensive nursery in the Northern Hemisphere. Adaptive lighting systems, specialized sound therapy equipment, temperature-regulated air that was supposed to be beneficial to neurological development, a rotating schedule of occupational therapists and vision specialists, and developmental pediatricians that cost more per week than most Americans earned in a year. And through all of it, Elias lay in his crib or sat in his chair or was held by whichever nanny was on shift, his dark eyes, his mother's eyes, Naomi's exact eyes in a small round face, open but unseeing, present but somehow not there. By the time Elias turned 2 years old, he had not made meaningful eye contact in 4 months. The specialists now spoke about managing expectations, about quality of life, about focusing on what Elias could do rather than what he could not. Dominic had asked them to leave his house. He sat in the nursery that night, alone, in the rocking chair that Naomi had picked out before Elias was born, She had insisted on a real wooden rocking chair, the old-fashioned kind, because she said babies deserved things that were real, and he sat there until 3 in the morning, not crying, not speaking, just sitting with his son in the silence. He was not a man who admitted defeat, but he was a man who was beginning to understand that some walls could not be bought down, that some doors did not have prices on them, that there existed in this world problems for which money, for all its power, was simply the wrong key. He just did not yet know what the right key looked like. He had no way of knowing that in 6 weeks, she would arrive wearing a yellow raincoat and carrying a plastic water bottle shaped like a frog, and she would be 3 years old, and she would not know she was doing anything at all. The job posting had been straightforward. Dominic's household manager, a meticulous woman named Patricia, who had been running the domestic operations of the Hargrove estate for 11 years, had drafted the listing herself. They needed a daytime housekeeper, someone reliable, someone discreet, someone who understood that a grieving billionaire and his medically fragile toddler required a particular kind of quiet professionalism. They were not. Patricia had been very clear about this, looking for someone who brought complications. Clara Mendez was 28 years old when she answered that listing. She had been in the United States for 6 years, having come from a small city in Mexico where her mother still lived and where Clara still sent money every month without fail. She had a community college certificate in hospitality management, 3 impeccable references, and a work history that showed up perfectly on every background check Patricia ran. She also had a daughter. Rosalind Mendez, Rosie, was 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days old on the day Clara came in for her second interview. Rosie's father had not been in the picture since before Rosie was born. This was not something Clara talked about at length, not because it shamed her, but because it simply was not interesting to her. She had made her peace with it before her daughter was even born, and she had decided somewhere in her 3rd trimester that the story of her life was not going to be defined by what was absent from it. Rosie had her mother's dark eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin, and an enthusiasm for life that was, frankly, almost exhausting to be around. She talked constantly. She asked questions about everything. She had opinions about which color cup was best for juice. Blue? Always blue. Green was simply unacceptable, and she carried with her at all times a plastic water bottle shaped like a frog that her grandmother had sent from Mexico, which she called Señor Frog, and treated with the solemnity usually reserved for important diplomatic relationships. The complication, from Patricia's perspective, was that Clara's childcare arrangement had recently fallen through. Her neighbor, who had been watching Rosie during Clara's working hours, had moved unexpectedly. Clara was in the process of finding a new arrangement, she explained. 2 weeks, maybe 3, but in the meantime, she would need to bring Rosie with her to work. Just temporarily. Just until she sorted it out. Patricia had said no. Politely but firmly no. This was not that kind of household. This was a quiet home, a careful home, a home where noise and chaos and the unpredictability of small children were not. Dominic had been walking past his own office door when he heard the conversation. He had stopped without knowing why. He had listened. And then he had stepped into the hallway and said, very quietly, "Let her bring the child." Patricia had turned around with an expression she usually reserved for situations where the financial projections came back worse than expected. "Sir, given Elias's condition, the doctors have recommended." "I know what the doctors recommended," Dominic said. His voice was even. It was always even. "Let her bring the child." He did not know why he said it. He told himself later it was practicality. Clara was the most qualified candidate they had seen in weeks, and losing her over a temporary childcare issue was inefficient. He told himself it was a business decision. He did not examine it any more closely than that. Clara started on a Monday. She arrived at 7:15 in the morning, 15 minutes early, wearing a neat gray uniform and carrying a bag over one shoulder and holding Rosie's hand with the other. Rosie was wearing a yellow raincoat. It was not raining. It had not rained in days, but she had apparently decided that morning that the yellow raincoat was necessary, and she was carrying Senior Frog in the crook of her arm like a clutch purse. She walked into the Hargrove estate and looked up at the soaring entrance hall, the marble floors, the chandelier that cost more than most houses, the grand staircase curving up toward the higher floors, and said, very seriously, "Mama, this house is very big." "See, Mija," Clara said, squeezing her hand. "Does a giant live here?" Clara had closed her eyes briefly in the manner of a woman asking heaven for patience. Patricia had made a sound that, in a different context, might have been the precursor to a laugh, though she would later deny this. Dominic, who had been standing at the top of the staircase and had heard every word, had felt something shift inside his chest. It was small. It was barely anything. But it was the first time in longer than he could clearly remember that something had moved in there, in that sealed-off, carefully maintained place behind his ribs where feelings were kept under strict administrative control. He went back to his office. He did not come downstairs until mid-morning. Clara worked with an efficiency and a quietness that Patricia grudgingly admitted was impressive. Rosie, for her part, understood, because Clara had clearly explained this to her several times, that she was a guest in this house, and that being a good guest meant being helpful and not touching things that weren't hers, and using her inside voice. Rosie's inside voice was approximately the volume of a regular person's outside voice, but this was, Clara had decided, a battle for another day. For the first 3 days, Rosie did not go near the 3rd floor. She stayed in the kitchen with her mother, or in the small sitting room off the back garden that Patricia had designated as her space, with her coloring books and her stuffed animals and Senior Frog, who was always nearby. But Rosie was 3, and 3-year-olds, no matter how well instructed, are fundamentally interested in everything. They are small scientists with no off switch and no sense of danger and a bone-deep conviction that every closed door is an invitation. On the 4th day, while Clara was cleaning the formal dining room on the 2nd floor and Patricia was in her office doing inventory, Rosie followed the sound. She heard it from the hallway. It was very faint, not crying, not quite crying, more like the sound of a child making small, aimless sounds the way children do when they are alone, and not quite asleep and not quite awake either. Rosie stopped in the hallway and listened. Then she walked toward the sound because she was 3, and that is what 3-year-olds do. The door to Elias's nursery was not locked. It was not even fully closed. The occupational therapist who had visited that morning had left it slightly ajar, which was against the usual protocol but was the kind of small human error that happens in every household, regardless of how much that household costs to run. Rosie pushed it open with one small hand and walked in. She had never seen a room like this. Even by the standards of the enormous house she had been navigating for 4 days, this room was something different. It was soft. Everything in it was soft, the lighting low and warm, the walls painted a deep calming blue, the floor carpeted in something that felt like clouds under her sandals. Mobiles turned slowly above a crib in the corner, catching the light. There were shelves of toys that no one was playing with. And in the middle of the room, in a specialized supportive chair that had been designed and built to his exact measurements, sat a small boy. He was smaller than Rosie. She could see that right away. Smaller and somehow more delicate, with dark hair that curled at the ends and skin that was brown and warm even in the gentle light of the room. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and his face tilted slightly upward, in the particular way of people who are listening to the world rather than watching it. His eyes were open. They were very dark, very beautiful eyes. They were not looking at anything. Rosie stood in the doorway for a moment and studied him with a frank, unself-conscious curiosity that is the exclusive property of very young children and research scientists.
"Hi," she said.
He did not respond. His hands moved slightly in his lap, a small, reflexive movement, but his face did not turn toward her. Rosie considered this. She walked further into the room, past the shelves of toys, until she was standing a few feet away from his chair. She tilted her head to one side. He was making a small sound now, that same soft, aimless sound she had followed down the hallway, and she listened to it for a moment, and then she said again, more gently this time, as if she understood that something was different here, even if she did not have the words for what it was. "Hi. My name is Rosie." "Nothing." His eyes continued their unfocused gaze at some middle distance that only he could perceive. Rosie sat down on the floor in front of him, cross-legged, the way she sat during story time. She set Senior Frog in her lap. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment, this small boy who was not looking back at her. And then she did what 3-year-olds do when they encounter something they don't understand and don't know how to fix but feel they should do something about anyway. She started talking to him. She told him about the house. She told him it was very big and that she had thought a giant might live there, but that actually it seemed like a daddy lived there, and also a lady named Patricia, who was very serious, and also her mama, who was the best mama. She told him about Senior Frog, and she held Senior Frog up to approximately the height of his face and moved it slightly, in case he wanted to look at it. He did not look at it. She told him about her abuela in Mexico, and about the color blue being the best color for juice cups, and about how she had a yellow raincoat, but she had left it downstairs today, which she was a little bit worried about.
All of this took some time.
The light shifted slowly in the room. When Clara appeared in the doorway, breathless, having noticed Rosie's absence, following a trail of instinct through the large house, she stopped dead at what she saw. Her daughter, cross-legged on the floor of this extraordinary room, speaking quietly and earnestly to a small boy who did not appear to be responding at all. For a moment Clara did not speak. Something about the image held her still. The quality of Rosie's attention, the complete seriousness with which her daughter was conducting this one-sided conversation, the gentle and businesslike way she was offering Senior Frog for inspection. Then she said, very quietly, "Rosie." Rosie looked up.
"Mama."
"This is a boy. He's not talking back, but I think he is listening." Clara crossed the room and picked up her daughter. "We're not supposed to be in here, Mija. Come." "But Mama." "Come." She carried Rosie out of the room and pulled the door closed behind her, and stood in the hallway for a moment with her heart going too fast and her daughter's arms around her neck. She had not known, until that moment, what was wrong with the child in that room. She had been told only that the young master had a medical condition and that the 3rd floor was private. She had not asked questions because it was not her place to ask questions. But she knew now, with the certainty of a mother, what she had seen in those dark and wandering eyes. She held Rosie tightly against her chest, and she said a small, silent prayer, not for her job, though she was afraid for her job, but for that small boy sitting alone in his beautiful room. She did not tell Dominic what had happened. She did not tell Patricia. She went downstairs and finished her work and took Rosie home on the bus and made dinner, and gave Rosie a bath and read her 3 books before bed, and she thought about those eyes all night. She did not know that across the city, in that enormous house, a father was sitting in a rocking chair in the same room where his son now slept, trying to understand why, for just a fraction of a second that afternoon, Elias's hands had moved in a way that looked almost like reaching. Something had changed. Dominic could not name it, and he did not trust things he could not name, but he felt it nevertheless. He had reviewed the monitoring footage from the nursery, because of course there were cameras, positioned for safety, approved by all of Elias's care team, and he had watched the 47 minutes that Rosie had spent in his son's room. He had watched it twice. Then he had watched it a third time. There was a moment, around the 20-minute mark, when Rosie had held up the small frog-shaped water bottle toward Elias's face, tilting it so that the little plastic eyes were roughly at his eye level. She had been talking the entire time. He could not hear exactly what she was saying. The audio was not clear enough for that, but he could see her mouth moving, animated and earnest, and he could see the way she moved Senior Frog slightly left and slightly right, the way you might try to get a distracted cat to look at something. And at the 23-minute mark, Dominic had watched this moment 9 times now, had paused and rewound and watched again. Elias's eyes had moved. Just slightly. Not tracking. Not focusing. But moving in a direction. In the direction of the frog. It was probably nothing. Dr. Petrosian had told him, in very careful and compassionate language, that what he was seeing was likely a reflexive response to motion in the peripheral field and should not be interpreted as voluntary visual attention. Dominic had said he understood. He had watched the footage for more times. Over the following 2 weeks, he found reasons to be on the second floor when he would normally be in his office. He told himself this was about workflow. His home office felt stuffy. He was considering reconfiguring the space. He moved a secondary workstation to a room whose window faced the back garden, where, on warm afternoons, Clara sometimes took Rosie to play while the nanny took Elias outside in his adapted stroller. He watched his son and the small girl in the yellow raincoat from the window above. He watched the way Rosie would plant herself in front of the stroller and address Elias with the same focused seriousness she brought to everything, talking and gesturing and occasionally holding Senior Frog up as what appeared to be an exhibit or a visual aid. He watched the way his son's hands would move. He did not say anything. He went back to work. On a Wednesday afternoon, in the 3rd week of Clara's employment, Dominic came home early from a meeting that had ended ahead of schedule. He came through the back entrance, which he used when he didn't want to announce himself, a habit from years of arriving unannounced at offices to get an accurate read on what was actually happening. He could hear, as he came through the kitchen hallway, a voice, Rosie's voice, coming from the direction of the first-floor sitting room. He moved quietly to the doorway and looked in. Clara was in the sitting room with Elias. She had been permitted, over the past week, to provide some afternoon hours of companionship to Elias while his nanny had a scheduled break. Patricia had arranged this after observing that Elias seemed calmer, in some indefinable way, when Rosie was in the vicinity. Rosie was sitting on the large rug in the center of the room, a few feet from Elias in a supportive chair, conducting what appeared to be an extremely detailed orientation session. She was holding up objects from the basket of toys Clara had brought down, naming each one with great authority, and then placing them carefully on the rug. "This is a red ball," Rosie was saying. "Ball. Red ball. This is a duck. This is a block. This block is yellow. Yellow like my raincoat." She reached into the bag and produced Senior Frog. "This is Senior Frog," she said. "You already know him. He is my best frog." She held Senior Frog up to roughly the height of Elias's face. And Dominic watched. He stood in the doorway, and he watched with everything he had, as his son's head turned. Not much. Perhaps 2 centimeters. Perhaps less. But it turned toward the frog, toward the small plastic eyes. Dominic's hand found the doorframe. Rosie, because she was 3 and 3-year-olds live entirely in the present moment, did not register this as extraordinary. She simply took it as her due and said, "Yes, this is Senior Frog," and gave the bottle a small shake so that the water inside sloshed and the morning light caught the green plastic in a particular way. And Elias's head turned a fraction further. Dominic did not move for a very long time. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the doorframe, and he breathed very carefully, The way you breathe when you are afraid that if you move even slightly, the thing you are watching will stop. Clara, who was sitting quietly in the corner of the room, looked up and saw him. She started to rise, her employer, appearing without warning, watching her daughter interact with his son, but he caught her eye and shook his head, very slightly. She sat back down. They stayed like that, the three of them, in the soft afternoon light. Rosie continued her inventory. Elias's hands moved and stilled and moved again. And Dominic Hargrove, who had not cried since his wife's funeral because he had decided quite deliberately that crying was not going to help anything, stood in his own doorway and felt something behind his eyes that he could not explain and did not try to. That evening he called Dr. Petrosian. He described what he had seen, both incidents, the footage and the afternoon. He was precise and detailed because he was always precise and detailed. He asked the doctor to come the following morning. Dr. Petrosian said she would. She also said carefully, "Dominic, I want to be cautious about what we conclude from this." "I know," he said. Reflexive responses can look like. "I know," he said. "Come tomorrow." He hung up. He sat in his office for a while without doing anything. Then he got up, went to the third floor, and sat in the rocking chair next to Elias's crib for 2 hours while his son slept, in the old way, in the counting way, the days since his eyes had last moved with what might have been purpose. He was, for the first time in a very long time, counting down instead of up. Dr. Petrosian arrived at 8:30 the following morning and spent 2 hours with Elias. She conducted a full assessment, the standard battery, plus several additional tests she had been wanting to try for weeks, prompted by something she did not quite name but which had to do with the quality of the observations Dominic had shared with her the night before. Afterward, she sat across from Dominic in his study, and she was quiet for a moment before she spoke. "Something is different," she said. He waited. "The tracking responses I observed today, they're inconsistent, and I want to be very careful not to overclaim. But what you described and what I observed this morning when I used a brightly colored moving object at close range," she paused. "There is something there that was not measurable 3 weeks ago." Dominic was very still. "What does that mean?" "It means," Dr. Petrosian said carefully, "that the neural pathways we believed were non-functional may be," she searched for the word, "waking up. Very slowly. Very unevenly. But the signal is there in a way it wasn't before." "Why?" he said. "What changed?" She spread her hands. "I cannot tell you that with certainty. What I can tell you is that we have substantial evidence that social engagement, particularly with peers, particularly with other children whose interactions are spontaneous and unpredictable rather than therapeutic and structured, can create neurological stimulation that we cannot replicate in a clinical setting. The emotional component, the genuine quality of engagement," she paused again. "Children know when someone is genuinely interested in them. Even children who cannot see. Even children whose processing is compromised in ways we don't fully understand. They know." Dominic thought about Rosie sitting cross-legged on his nursery floor for 47 minutes, explaining the hierarchy of juice cup colors to a boy who did not look at her and whom she did not stop talking to anyway.
"She's not doing therapy," he said.
"She doesn't know she's doing anything." "Exactly," Dr. Petrosian said. "That might be exactly why it's working." That afternoon, Dominic went downstairs and found Clara in the kitchen at the end of her shift, collecting Rosie's scattered crayons from the table. Rosie was sitting on the kitchen counter. She had apparently established that this was her preferred position, eating an apple and telling a story to Senor Frog about a princess who had a very big house. Dominic sat down at the kitchen table. Clara stopped what she was doing and looked at him with the expression of someone who is prepared for a wide variety of news, none of it necessarily good. "I want to talk to you about Rosie," he said. Clara's expression did not change, but her hands stilled on the table. "I want to ask, with your permission, if she would be willing to spend more time with Elias. Not in a structured way. Not in a therapy way. Just," he stopped. The sentence was harder to finish than he had expected. "Just the way she has been. Whatever she does. The talking and he made a gesture that meant Señor Frog. Whatever she does. I would like to," he stopped again. He was not accustomed to not being able to finish sentences. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was a woman who had learned to read silences. You learned that when you did the work she did, in the houses she had worked in, where so much was communicated without being said. She read this one carefully. "She likes him," Clara said. "She asks about him every day when we go home. She says the quiet boy." She paused. "She told me last week that she thinks he is listening even when he doesn't look back. That she thinks he just needs more time." Dominic looked at the table. "She's 3, he said. Not as a dismissal. More as if he was reminding himself of something important. "She is," Clara agreed. "She figured out something that 7 specialists couldn't tell me in 2 years. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, "Children don't carry the weight of what's not working. They just—" She glanced at her daughter, who was now explaining something to Señor Frog in a tone of some urgency. "They just stay." Dominic looked at his hands on the table. His very expensive watch. The hands that had built things and signed things and shaken other hands across conference tables on 4 continents. Hands that did not know how to hold the right kind of stillness. "I would like to pay you more," he said, "for Rosie's time with Elias. And I would like to ask if you would consider," he took a breath, "if you would consider a permanent arrangement. Here. The house is large. There is a suite on the 2nd floor that has been empty since." He did not finish that sentence. "It would have its own entrance. Your privacy would be completely respected." But I think he was doing it again, stopping, which he never did. "I think my son needs your daughter nearby." Clara looked at him for a long time. "Let me think about it," she said. He nodded. He got up from the table. He was almost at the door when Rosie called out from her counter. "Excuse me." He turned. She was looking at him with great seriousness, the apple in one hand and Señor Frog in the other. "Is the quiet boy going to be okay?" He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen and looked at this 3-year-old girl in her gap-toothed directness and her complete lack of guile, and he thought about how long it had been since anyone had asked him anything that simply. "I think so," he said. It was the first time in 2 years he had said those words and meant them. Rosie nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to her apple and her frog and her story about the princess. What happened next was not a single moment. Life rarely works that way, despite what we might wish. There was no single morning when Dominic walked into the nursery and Elias turned to him with clear, focused eyes, and everything was fixed. It did not work like that. It has never worked like that. What happened was slower and more profound and, in its own way, more remarkable for being gradual, because every small step was a gift, and because Dominic was there for all of them. Dr. Petrosian adjusted the therapeutic protocol. She incorporated Rosie's presence, officially with documentation, with the precise language of a medical consultant who had been surprised enough times in her career to recognize that the thing working is the thing worth studying, into Elias's daily care plan. She called it peer-mediated environmental enrichment, which was a very clinical way of describing a 3-year-old girl sitting on a rug and talking about frogs. Clara accepted the offer of the 2nd floor suite. She did not accept it immediately, and she negotiated the terms carefully because she was a woman who knew the value of her own dignity and was not prepared to compromise it regardless of the size of the house she was being invited into. She negotiated clear working hours and clear personal hours and a formal employment contract that Patricia drafted with the same meticulousness she brought to everything. She also negotiated a proper salary, not the inflated number Dominic had initially offered, which she told him felt like payment for her daughter's time and was therefore not something she was comfortable accepting. Dominic had looked at her across the table during that conversation with an expression she had not seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it as respect. Rosie moved her coloring books and her stuffed animals and Senor Frog into the second-floor suite and announced that she liked her new room and that the window was good for looking at birds. She adapted to the new arrangement with the total, fearless flexibility that is the great gift of the very young, for whom home is less a place than a collection of people. She continued to visit Elias every day. She continued to talk to him. She continued to present Senor Frog for inspection with the same patient ceremony. Though she had by now expanded her repertoire, she had discovered that the fish mobile above his crib produced a response when she pointed at it and named the fish, so she had named all 12 fish and reported their names to Elias daily, along with any updates she felt were relevant. 3 weeks after Clara moved in, Elias tracked the fish mobile for 4 continuous seconds. Dr. Petrosian, who had been present with her monitoring equipment, made a sound that was not scientific at all. 6 weeks after Clara moved in, Elias turned his head toward the sound of Rosie's voice when she came into the room. Not toward light.
Toward her voice specifically.
Dominic was sitting in the rocking chair when it happened. He watched his sons head turned toward the door before Rosie was even fully inside the room. He watched the fine motor movement of those small hands, reaching, unmistakably reaching, toward the sound of her. He did not say anything. He put his hand over his mouth, and he breathed. The morning it happened, the actual morning, the one he would describe later to Dr. Petrosian in a voice that was not quite steady, Elias was 9 weeks into what everyone was now calling, carefully, a recovery trajectory.
It was a Tuesday. Ordinary.
Clara was cleaning upstairs. Rosie was in the nursery with Elias, attended by the morning nanny, doing her daily orientation session. She had been telling him, for the past several mornings, about the garden. About a bird she had seen, a cardinal, which she called the red bird with a reverence that suggested she considered it significant, and about how the flowers in the back garden were beginning to come up because it was spring, and that was what flowers did in spring. She had Senor Frog in her hands. She was demonstrating, apparently, some aspect of the story that required the frog's involvement as a visual aid. She tipped the bottle. Just slightly. Not on purpose. She had been gesturing as she talked, and the bottle tipped, and the cap, which had been loosened from earlier drinking, gave way. A small cascade of water splashed across Elias's face.
He gasped.
His hands flew up. And then his eyes focused. They focused on Rosie. They focused on her face, her wide, horrified, apple-cheeked face, looking at him from a distance of approximately 12 inches, both hands clapped over her mouth, Senor Frog dangling from her fingers, the emptied water bottle on the floor between them. Elias looked at her. He looked at her for 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds. He looked at her face with the focused, tracking gaze that his doctors had told Dominic he might never see. The clear, connected, purposeful gaze of a child who is seeing and processing and responding to what is in front of him. He looked at Rosie. And then, because he was 2 years old, and 2 years old is an age at which feelings are large and uncontained and have no patience for propriety, his mouth opened, and he cried. Not the flat, disconnected sounds of the months before. Real crying, the outraged, astonished crying of a child who has been surprised by cold water and is not pleased about it. The nanny was already running. Clara, who had heard something from the floor above, was on the stairs. In 30 seconds, the room was full of people, and the crying was loud, and Rosie was standing in the middle of it all, still frozen with her hands over her mouth. And Dominic, who had been in his study when he got the nanny's call and had come up the stairs at something that was not quite running but would not be accurately described as walking either, pushed through the doorway and saw his son crying with full and furious presence, and crying while actively, visually, purposefully looking at the small girl in front of him. He crossed the room. He picked up his son, who looked at him, dark eyes tracking and focusing on his father's face, and Dominic held Elias against his chest, and he finally, in the privacy of a room full of people, came apart. Not the crumbling kind of falling apart. Not the helpless kind. The other kind, the kind that is made of gratitude so large it has nowhere else to go but out, through the places in a person they have spent years keeping sealed. Dr. Petrosian, when she came that afternoon, had a technical explanation. The cold water stimulus. The autonomic nervous system response. The way a sudden, unexpected sensory input of sufficient intensity can, in certain cases of idiopathic visual cortex underperformance, trigger a breakthrough activation in the dormant pathways. She said it carefully and thoroughly, and Dominic listened to every word. He also called what happened by its other name. In his own heart, in the rocking chair that night with his son asleep against his chest, he called it by what it was. Weeks later, he and Clara were in the garden on an evening when Rosie and Elias were playing on the grass, Elias unsteady on his feet and squinting in the late light, Rosie narrating every action for him with her customary thoroughness, Senor Frog presiding from a nearby chair. He watched his son look at a flower. A real looking, a tracking, a focusing on the small yellow petals in the fading light. "I want to ask you something," Dominic said. Clara looked at him. "When you came here," he paused. "Did you know that she would?" "No," Clara said simply. She just wanted to talk to him. She does that. She talks to everything. She talked to a parking meter for 6 minutes last month, and she was completely serious about it. He was quiet for a moment. On the grass, Rosie was explaining to Elias the correct names of all the flowers, which she had clearly made up, because the tall orange ones were called abuelas and the small blue ones were called Senor Frog's friends. She talked to him like he was already whole, Dominic said. She didn't know he wasn't, Clara said. No, he agreed. She didn't.
He thought about that.
About how his son had been surrounded for 2 years by people who knew what was wrong, who treated him with the careful and loving attention of those who were looking at absence, who saw, every day, what was missing. And this small girl had walked in and seen none of that. Had seen only a boy who was a little quiet and who might want to hear about frogs and fish and the names of colors. Had seen him as already whole. What followed in the months after was a recovery that Dr. Petrosian called unprecedented in the literature, that brought journalists and medical researchers to Dominic's door, and that he declined to discuss publicly, not because he wanted to keep it private, but because some things are diminished by being turned into headlines. Elias's vision continued to improve with targeted therapy, with Rosie's presence in his daily life, with time and patience, and the work of doctors who were no longer working against something unknown, but with something that had found its beginning. He would carry, for years, a slight light sensitivity. He would need glasses before he started school. His developmental timeline would be its own, not anyone else's. But he saw. He saw the garden and the fish mobile and the cardinal that Rosie had decided was a significant bird. He saw his father's face across the breakfast table. He saw the morning light and the stars on clear nights when Rosie dragged him to the window to look at them and told him their names, which she had entirely invented. And on a Thursday evening in early spring, 2 years after Clara and Rosie first walked into the Hargrove estate, Elias, now 4, sitting in the garden with Senior Frog in his lap, squinting happily at the orange flowers he had been told were called abuelas. He looked up at the window and saw his father watching from above, and he raised one small hand and waved. Dominic waved back. It was the most important thing he had ever done. Thank you for staying until the end. This story is a reminder that the most profound healing sometimes comes not from the most sophisticated solutions, but from the most ordinary love, from someone who simply looks at us and sees us as already whole. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And wherever you're watching from, thank you for being here. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for being part of this channel. If these stories bring you comfort, inspiration, or simply brighten your day, you can support the channel by clicking the thanks button below the video. Your support helps me continue creating more heartfelt stories for this wonderful community, and truly, every bit of support means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and thank you for being here.